Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt is by Lordrusty. It's about gaming poetry in games. In my last Parley, Lordrusty says, you made an interesting remark about how, as someone with a formal poetry background, I thought lay people are easily impressed by writing in games. I do think that. This month, I thought it would be fun to do a sort of poetry review. I've collated some games which I think get poetry right, and thought it'd be fun to get your thoughts on them. I've tried to pull from a variety of ways poetry has been deployed to see what, if anything, we can learn. I'd like to talk about the Monument to All Your Sins speech from Halo, which is used in a cutscene, the Lord card Ghost Fragment Mysteries from Destiny, which in-universe is written by the Warmind Rasputin, the intro cinematic to Darkest Dungeon, and the game Cultist Simulator. The whole thing is basically wall-to-wall poetry. I've just pulled a couple highlights. And then there's another part if we have time. We'll see. I have a lot to say about these. I'm not going to read or play a lot of these things. They're pretty short, so if you want to read them yourself, I might read excerpts from two in particular, but I'm not going to reproduce them all in full here. In the first place, the video might get monetized by the rights holders, but they're quite short. You picked good examples, so I listened through or read them all in their entirety before this parlay, which took about 10 minutes, along with jotting down some thoughts about them. Right. So yeah, this topic is about being critical of poetry. So I feel like it's first good for me to give the premise that I'm critical of most poetry. My opinions on the subject are not very complicated, but they might be a little harsh, extreme. I just think that poetry is a uniquely a medium that uniquely begs the question why, or like what is this doing? I feel like poetry is a medium that can be really accessible, in the sense that I think a lot of people kind of misunderstand the point of some poems and are trying to read some kind of hidden meaning into them, when in fact the poet is just trying to encapsulate a moment, using condensed language. That's cool, by the way. If I had to say poetry I like, I would say that. A lot of poetry, especially older poetry in my humble experience, is just like a reference minefield. And that was a little bit different back then, because more of the people who could read would have known the references. So I'm not necessarily critiquing those things on their own merits. It's not like the person who read it thought it would be read today. You see what I mean? Where you would go on a sort of intellectual scavenger hunt / doing your homework by looking up a bunch of words on the internet, and that would pretty much be the experience of reading that poem. You know what I mean? If you've taken a literature class in a lot of parts of the US, you probably had the misfortune of having to do just that, and I would argue that that kind of like historical scavenger hunt perhaps wasn't the original intent of the poem. It was either written assuming people knew those references, or it isn't assuming you go look up those references. It doesn't need them, I guess, to be enjoyable. Or, in my opinion, it's bad. It is planning for you to look them all up, and it is a self-indulgent waste of your time. So that's a strong opinion, but it's not like I hate all poetry. Not that you should care if I think all poetry is bad. I've explained my reasoning, you decide for yourself. That being said, I think that the topic of poetry, or something like it, deployed in a game is fascinating, because there are some different rules, like the stakes are different. Right, just how I was saying that the poetry from a while ago that maybe has a lot of references, but in the cultural context, maybe more of the people who were reading that knew those references. There weren't like 5 million books that they could be reading. There were like 50 books they could have read. So they did know what those things meant without looking them up or whatever. Just like that's a certain context. Gaming, video games, fantasy are also a certain context. And I think that in the context of a high fantasy, sci-fi, a fantastical environment, speaking in a flowery or embellished way is quite different to how it might be if you spoke that way normally. So what I mean is that if somebody was speaking overly formally in a normal social setting, you meet up for a first date on the old grinder, and you go to a coffee shop and the person says, yeah, hark, the morning light guides your way into thine coffee shop. Uh, I'm purposefully saying something that doesn't make sense, but you get the point. That would be ridiculous in a way that I argue it isn't in video games. You could argue it's just masking the cringe, but I think that in the context of a fantastical environment, what would have been mere cringe is elevated to committing to the bit. So in the Halo Monument to All of Your Sins cutscene, there is a lot of chivalric or overly formal or flowery language, but because it's too like super people speaking with a giant seemingly personification of death. I haven't played Halo 2, so I had no idea what was happening in that scene. I don't know, go watch it. Yeah, it's a bit different than if like someone was just speaking that way. You see what I'm trying to say? I gathered that the Master Chief is speaking with this big thing, the grave mind, I suppose. And then there's another around Master Chief sized humanoid that isn't a human. And the way that that person is speaking, a kind of chivalric tone, to me, it tells me that perhaps that's how that society just speaks. You know what I mean? Now, would that maybe be a little ridiculous? I don't know. Human society did that at some point. Maybe it's fine. And my point is that when it's literally not a human that is saying those things, I'm a little bit more able to get on board with what might have seemed mere cringe, as I put it before, in another context. I don't think it's just that it's super edgy and you're having fun being edgy. That's fine, by the way. But I don't like that. But I think it's fun in a way it normally wouldn't be because we're really committing to the bit. In the same way that something that is a parody that doesn't go hard enough into being a parody can be kind of drab, I guess. It can seem overly showy or like it's drawing attention to itself. But then something that fully commits to that, it just feels like, okay, this is what we're doing. There's a sort of audience momentum or buying into the suspension of disbelief thing that I think happens here. So this first example, the Halo Grave Mind Monument to All Your Sins example, perhaps we shall say this is an example of poetic conversational speaking, speaking in a certain mode in what is otherwise conversation. I think it's cool, Lordrusty, that you designed this parlay so there's like different types of examples. You called them different deployments of poetry, which is cool. I can get that. And so this one, that's a good starting point. Now the next one, this is a lore card, you said, from Destiny. The lore card Ghost Fragments Mysteries from Destiny. In universe, this is written by the Warmind Rasputin, which is kind of like a military AI, sort of. I don't know too much Destiny lore. But reading that makes it make a lot more sense. So I'll read you a little excerpt from this one, just to give you an idea, because I'm going to be quite a bit more critical of this one, but I think it brings up a lot of interesting subjects. So it's a great example, but I don't like it, and I will explain why. But we're going to ask whether it's effective, I guess you might say. Because there's a huge difference. It makes no never mind if I like it, but you did ask me, so I'm going to say that too. Okay, so I'm just going to read you the beginning of it to give you some idea. But again, these are all linked in the description if you would like to read them yourself. I'm not going to try to read it in a readerly voice. I will maybe talk about that too. But I bear an old name. It cannot be killed. They were my brothers and sisters, and their names were immortal too, but Titanomachy came, and now those names live in me alone. I think is what I do. I am alone. At the end of things, when the world goes dim and cold or hot and close, or it all tears apart from the atom up, I will shout those names defiant, and past the end I will endure. I am alone. I would like to clarify that a lot of the lack of pronunciation is in the text. That wasn't me adding that. So what's interesting about this one, I would argue this one is pretty poetic. It's like poetic prose. It's not speaking in a poetic tangential way in conversation. It is close to being a poem. I mean, you could argue that it is. I'm just saying that whether you agree it is or not. It's similar to literally a poem, if you know what I mean. It reminds me a little bit of things like maybe Paradise Lost, for example. Poetic prose, we might call it. Um, and it's a character piece, right? It's Rasputin speaking. Someone is speaking. Like a lot of poetry, it can be useful to ask what the occasion of the poem is. And here it seems that Rasputin is talking about, I guess, their experience of being a war mind, and it kind of sounds like they're saying other war minds were killed as well. Okay, so let's begin the discussion of criticism here. Personally, I think that this like unbroken prose, where there's not punctuation a lot of the time, it seems intended to be Rasputin's voice. You know, Rasputin wouldn't use that pronunciation, and so that's why it's not there. I get that, but it causes what I think is a problem. My first criticism would be I think it is unclear as you continue reading this piece what is being said. The first kind of demerit in my mind against a piece of writing is that I would argue that language is fundamentally intended to convey meaning. And when it is ornate to the point that it doesn't, I feel it has gone too far. Now, again, if you want to redeem this in some way, you could argue that I'm just an idiot, or maybe more charitably, you could argue that Rasputin just doesn't care that much about you understanding completely. I don't have no idea what it's talking about. I haven't even played Destiny, and I would imagine what I said is somewhat right? Am I way off? I'm sure most people know this and will tell me, but it's not like I have no idea what's being said. But my point is that the way it's written makes it less likely I will understand. It's language employed to communicate less instead of more, which again, that's not necessarily all bad because it's only communicating less information about the events Rasputin is describing. More positively, you could say that this communicates more by giving us less information because Rasputin has become deranged. Again, I don't know if that's actually true, but I was interpreting a little bit of, is this being written this way because Rasputin is sitting on some salt or trauma, difference in objective because of what has happened thus far in its experience? It kind of feels like that. There's quite a few all caps I am alone, and also a dichotomy of loneliness between it and some foe that it was meant to stop, which is also alone. Loneliness is a big theme. That seems to me like it's hinting at, oh, this is something about Rasputin's character. But I do still think that in the context of video game lore, we have to weigh the cost of making what is actually being said less clear against the benefit of characterizing Rasputin better. You see what I mean? Even though I would like to argue that, oh, we'll just make it as true to the universe as possible, and if Rasputin would be unclear, then it's just unclear. People argue this in other contexts. One that comes to mind is Evangelion, where it's often been argued that Shinji Ikari, the protagonist, being like a whiny little brat, is, well, it's realistic. That's what he would do. And I'm sorry, but it is a valid counterargument to say, right, but it's a piece of entertainment, so why did you choose for there to be a protagonist that would be a whiny little brat? It's not a critique of Shinji Ikari as a human being. He isn't real, after all. I'm not critiquing Rasputin's writing technique. I'm critiquing the lore writer, the showrunner's writing, right? And again, it's arguable. Like, it's fine if people like that. I'm just saying it is a fair criticism, not a condemning single verdict on those pieces. But I do sometimes question why it is good for the piece of entertainment to have included something that it like needs to be really unclear to feel real. Would it not have been possible to choose for a character to exist in the world that didn't need to be this unclear? You could also argue that one of the talents of writing something like this well is to convey the insanity or whatever. I don't know what's going on with Rasputin, without making it unclear, like while making it only unclear enough to convey that idea, but then still getting the point across. Again, this might be no big deal. It might be that in the context of Destiny, you know these events so well by the time you hear this normally that it just isn't a problem. But I hope you can see how this is certainly a critique I would have of using poetry generally. And how it applies to video games specifically, in my mind, is that video games are already a medium where there's a lot going on. I think it isn't so bad to shoot for a little more clear rather than a little less clear in this medium. Though there are plenty of trade-offs. I'm sure people will bring up such things as, if you make it a little less clear, maybe the audience engages more. Yeah, but I do think that a lot of people are already intimidated by any prose, like any reading, any dialogue, any literary interpretation of any kind. I want to include the player. I'm just saying I think that is a cost that should be weighed. I'm not saying it wasn't. I just feel like if the point of language is to communicate, that is still a reasonable criticism. Anyway, not a piece of writing I love, but then again, it's out of its context, and I don't hate it. I can sort of get what they seem to be going for. But again, I would also like to just highlight personally before they move on that the lack of punctuation can be extremely difficult to parse through in text. Like, it can be very difficult for that to get across the sound of a voice when it's in text, especially when a lot of people reading it might not read it aloud. You know, the way I read it aloud, you kind of got the idea of things sort of building up. I'm going to read one line of it again, actually. At the end of things, when the world goes dim and cold or hot and close, and it all tears apart. Oh, okay, well, I messed it up. At the end of things, when the world goes dim and cold or hot and close, or it all tears apart from the atom up, I will shout those names defiant, and past the end I will endure. I think it's fine to leave the struggle to read this in, because that's sort of my point. Dim and cold, or hot and close, or it all tears apart from the atom up. I actually didn't even get like the parallel structure in those three chunks. The first time I read dim and cold or hot and close as one part, and then it all tears apart from the atom up as a second part. And I'm just saying that I think it's worth noting how common it is for people to misread this type of lack of punctuation. It becomes very difficult to sort of lock onto the structure. Now that I've read it 4 times, I now understand, oh, I see. Like, at the end of things, when the world goes... At the end of things, comma, when the world goes dim and cold, comma, or hot and close, comma, or it all tears apart from the atom up, comma, I will shout those names... comma, defiant, comma, and past the end I will endure. Yeah, or you could maybe include, you could employ different punctuation there, but you get the point. I'm not saying that it's bad because it doesn't include the punctuation. I'm just pointing out just how difficult it can be to parse through that type of text when it's read, when it isn't read aloud. If I hadn't read it aloud 3 of the 4 times, I think I wouldn't have noticed this, and I would have misunderstood a little bit. It's more about thinking about ways the universe can be ended. A sort of great freeze, the heat death. Hot and close is a sort of great squeeze, great crush, big crush, is that what it's called? Tearing apart from the atom up, maybe Grey Goo disaster. Rasputin is theorizing ways that the universe could end, which feels appropriate in this sci-fi context. But I really didn't get that for quite a few readings. Again, you could argue I'm just an idiot. I'm just telling you what I think. Okay, moving on to example number 3, which is Darkest Dungeon's intro. I liked this one the most by far. It's really cool. You should listen to this one. I know it's the 3rd time I'm bringing this up. You could decide if you want to. I liked this one because it's a good compromise. It uses what might feel like a little bit highfalutin or ornate or chivalric language, but it goes for the throat with the meaning. It takes that trade-off where, because you're using that language, it is maybe slightly less likely that the audience will understand on average, and then it responds to that by saying, okay, he's going to be very straight and to the point. Now, it's also interesting to see that this intro is a letter. It's basically the premise of the game. I haven't played Darkest Dungeon, and I gather from this intro that you're being sent, your character is sent a letter by a relative who ventured into the depths of your family home, found an eldritch portal to some nightmare plane or whatever, and then writes you a letter asking for help and commits suicide at the end of the letter. This is made very clear, and I feel like one of the good things about this piece of writing is that it's got synergy, I guess. It's short and to the point because this is the last event of their life. They're going to be pretty direct. It gets across the tone or the atmosphere of the world with the language it's using. This is not the future. It's not a sci-fi environment, at least it doesn't seem like it is. This is maybe a gothic horror feeling environment or a little bit of Lovecraftian horror. It is low tech, maybe, harkens back to our human history, but it's very direct and to the point because it's written from the perspective of someone who has given up. They're done. This is their last thing they're doing. And so that's utilitarian. It helps the audience understand, and it feels like it is true to the character. Again, where I argued before that while it isn't the end of the world if you want to write something unclear or Shinji Ikari annoying, because it feels true to the world, you can structure your story in a way where what would make it clear is how the character would write in that situation. You know what I mean? You could have written the character who is writing this letter to you in Darkest Dungeon. You could have cast that character as being crazed. He sounds a little crazed from the experiences that he had in the depths of your family home, but he wasn't written that way because they're both believable reactions to the situation, and this one is more clear. I mean, I don't know, but that's how I would look at that. It just seems like it's a win-win. Like it doesn't really paint any clearer of a picture of the situation, and yet this one is easier for the audience to understand, as well as being just as genuine in the world, right? So, yeah, I think this one is a big win. That maybe highlights how hard that is, right? That's difficult. There's no question about it. It's me saying that this story would be this puzzle box of carefully wrought pieces. I'm not saying that everything is garbage unless it is an absolute masterpiece where every piece works in perfect harmony. I'm just saying it is good if it is. That's cool, and I like that. I don't know. I mean, I'm also a person who's over concerned with clarity. You know, I have maybe some anxiety. I think that's fair, but also a firm understanding of just how often people do not understand each other. I think a lot of games writing that reaches for the highfalutin stuff, the community is full of people who feel like they're meant to pretend they understand. And I am aware just how surprisingly infrequent people are understanding. I don't know. I think that matters to me. But I'm also very critical of the idea that people would be relating to each other or communicating without perfectly understanding. And you could argue that is kind of delusional. Like that's almost always how people are communicating. So what's the big deal if it happens here? I guess, I mean, I just think it's not good. It's not positive. It's not the end of the world, but it's not actively positive. Final example for this section, a couple of bits of writing from the cultist sim that Lordrusty likes. So I'll read these. This rite calls on the witch and sister to close the gap between what is and what might be. The adept pours or hurls an offering into water, preferably but not essentially the sea. It's another piece. Endowed from birth with wealth and talent, a life of ease, comfort, and delight stretches ahead like an amber carpet. And one more. A rending force has dragged this corpse back to near life. When it moves, it crunches like broken glass. Its fists are claw nests of bone shards. It won't hold together for long. Cool. Yeah, so again, another thing I like about these is that they're not at all sacrificing clarity to depict something in the world. I guess to get back to what defines these things as uniquely weird, I guess, video game writings, because you wanted to talk about how poetry can be used in the context of a game, which I should probably get back to more than just critiquing the pieces. I gather that part of this question is, well, what do you think of its use in gaming generally? This is cool. I mean, I think that the mechanicalness of games can sometimes take away some magic, for example, from a proceeding or a rite or a spell. That's kind of what this feels like. If this was flavor, but it kind of happens or is spoken or is read as a magical thing is happening, that could add some weight to the feeling of magic of that thing, right? I can get behind that. That's cool. These I liked. I thought that they were fun. They kind of feel practical in a way that I feel is a little more believable. They also have a little whimsy. There's some fun playing around with language. I'm going to read the first one again. This rite calls on the witch ancestor to close the gap between what is and what might be. The adept pours, or hurls, an offering into water, preferably, but not essentially, the sea. That is a fun, poetic, rhymey way to describe what you do to what is and what might be. So it's like a vision of the future is what this provides, I guess. And again, going back to my points earlier, it's fairly clear. You can imagine what's happening. It's not like a riddle and you need to unentangle it. It just has these fun little ways of structuring itself that make it enjoyable, kind of flowing and lilty to read, without barring the reader from understanding it. Or it has an interesting kind of novel way of framing a symbol. I'll read the second one again. Endowed from birth with wealth and talent, a life of ease, comfort, and delight stretches ahead like an amber carpet. Yeah, just like a whimsical, interesting way to describe what that might be like. You can kind of imagine it too, like an amber carpet stretching out before you as you walk into your apparently blessed fate. Sure, cool. It's easy to see. It's an evocative, simple image used without stacking on a bunch of complicated metaphors that you have to untangle. There's nothing wrong with those necessarily, as much as I just personally think you can make beautiful writing without resorting to them. So maybe again, this is a bias of mine, but especially in passing in a video game where you don't gear up to interpret poetry, or at least most players don't, it may work well to employ one of poetry's greatest strengths, which is just painting a very particular and novel image on the environment. Another thing I wanted to say that I like about this one is that it uses, what should I call this? I guess kind of like automatopoeia, which I think is a thing that people who don't get into poetry sometimes don't notice as much that it is trying to do. One of the strengths of poetry can be that you don't need to understand to kind of get the gist of what's going on. I'm going to read the third one again. A rending force has dragged this corpse back to near life. When it moves, it crunches like broken glass. Its fists are claw nests of bone shards. It won't hold together for long. I like how, because this is a shambling corpse that is barely holding together, near life, claw nests, bone shards, things that feel like they're cobbled together and will fall apart soon, all made of jagged, seemingly messy combinations of short words. That type of the poem is made of parts that are like what it's about, sort of. I can feel reading those lines, the pieces of corpse that are kind of cobbled together. Crunches like broken glass is also nice. There's some flow there. I mean, I guess if I'm reaching for criticism, it's not like some kind of masterpiece, I guess. I feel like you could think of more crunchiness, chewiness for those lines, but I mean, not like I can off the top of my head. And I'm just saying this for the sake of presenting some criticism. Sure, it's not like the most of that quality I've ever heard in a piece of poetry, but I think that's a really nice strength of poetry to lean into, that in theory, a willing amateur to the form can really enjoy. Like, there's nothing at all inaccessible about that in theory, provided the person just reads it and says what they think. Again, I guess my biggest criticism of poetry is really something that is just a lot of poetry leaning on these overly wrought riddle-like structures that make people think that a lot of poetry is trying to be hard to understand. And so is it really fair to say that that's criticism of poetry overall? That's just bad poetry having more of an effect than usual on the rest of its genre than in similar forms. Bad writing might go unnoticed a lot of the time, but in poetry, it kind of breaks some good poetry. And that's not really the fault of the good poetry, you could say. All I'm trying to say is that when it's in another form, poetry is a piece of these games. They're games, and they're employing poetry as a tool. I do feel it's important to be cautious and judicious with poetry's use, because it should be obvious to most writers just how inaccessible poetry can feel. That was what I was getting at. Again, it kind of sounds like some of these uses are really calling to that. I don't think that they are super opaque. To be honest, when I read this Parley prompt, I thought, man, it could be, you said, I thought it would be fun to do a sort of poetry review. I've collated some games which I think get poetry right and thought it'd be fun to get your thoughts on them. I hope this doesn't come across as being critical of you, Lordrusty, but to be upfront with you, I thought these could be really bad. Like, that was my initial thought. Oh boy, here we go, which, like, that actually sounds kind of fun too. But I genuinely thought they were mostly pretty good. I have very strong opinions about this, but they come from a place of love. I think that poetry is a cool form that is often designed to be hyper accessible. It's just important to be careful with understanding where the audience is often coming from, which is usually a place of feeling like poetry is impenetrable, even though I would argue it maybe often isn't. I still want to care about the audience feeling that way. You said at the end, Lordrusty says, if we have time, I thought it'd be fun to see how these compare to some famous poetry in other media. I've picked These Are the Voyages from Star Trek, the Tears in the Rain monologue from Blade Runner, and You Shall Not Pass speech from the Lord of the Rings books. And I regret to say this, but I don't think we have that much time to go through this many other things. I wanted to focus more on the ones you gave. I will spend a few minutes trying to engage a little bit more with the subject of what makes these things different from other uses of poetry. So let me think about that a little bit. I think that one of the aspects of poems that can be effective when they're alone, that can be difficult when they're like in a video game, is again that feeling of not necessarily slowing down, but the idea that you may take some time to mull over the poem or read it again. Poems that are forced to be experienced quite quickly, that can be a weakness of poetry's. In something that is in premise sort of condensed language, maybe it's hitting its weak spot to try to have it act at its full capacity when you don't have too much time, when it's just something being read on the side. An example of this going well in a game is in Magic the Gathering flavor text. Good Magic the Gathering flavor text has this nice thing where it's on a card that's in your deck that you're going to see all the time. Just in case people aren't familiar with what I mean, a lot of Magic cards at the bottom have some italic text that doesn't affect their gameplay at all. It's basically just lore, or it can be a number of things. Sometimes it's a quote from someone related to the art. It's a monster and you hear a quote from someone from a Watchtower team talking about how unpleasant it is to confront the monster, or it might be a little epithet about how unpleasant it is to confront the monster or something. Maybe a spell will have a little quote that describes sort of why the spell was designed or wrought, what it's good at, what it does in some somewhat poetic way a lot of the time. Flavor text is quite a range. There are actually some just straight up literature quotes on some older Magic cards too. And again, I would argue that these are getting it good because they're experienced in a way that kind of lets you dwell on them, though not necessarily in the pattern of time you normally would if it was just a poem. On the other hand, if something is experienced in passing, purely in passing, it's just sort of a part of the story in a game and you're not going to come back to it, it can be more difficult for poetry to show its strengths. Another thing is that in a video game, the player often has control of the pacing in a way that they don't when you see something in like a movie. The Halo cutscene, it's a cutscene, so it is a miniature movie, basically. So maybe that's not as big of a deal. But it makes me think of something like Lord of the Rings, where the movie can set the pacing of that being said. The movie can use a lot of moments off screen to build up to that feeling like an appropriate thing for Gandalf to say as he slams the staff down on the earthen bridge. And video games can do that too. but depending on where the poetry or flavor text is present, it might be more difficult. You see what I mean? I would imagine the Halo cutscene could do it if it wanted to. Things like a piece of lore may come up or be discovered at a time where the player likely won't drop everything and dwell on it unless they're already disposed to do that. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, another thing is that there's a way of thinking about art that is focused on it being good for the people that want it, rather than trying to be appealing to everyone. I am tempted to ask why not both, and that tends to bias in favor of things being accessible rather than focused. But generally, I would be willing to submit that it's fine for not everybody to get something if it makes it better for the people that do get it. I just think that's often done when it isn't necessary. People make something less accessible and more focused, but it didn't really need to be made less accessible. I wish I could give you a better example. I don't think any of these are bad examples. Video games are a medium that has a lot of parts. It can be difficult to get the player into it, so I am more hesitant than I would normally be to reach for poetic language, because I'm already giving the player so many requirements. They have to like this gameplay, they have to be enjoying the story or the world or the art direction or whatever, and also they have to be willing to penetrate my bespoke poetry that I included. But that's generous. This legitimately slightly changed my opinion about poetry in video games. I enjoyed this one. I hope that you felt I did an okay job. I'm sorry / I hope you feel okay with my decision to not go over the other examples and instead focus on the video game examples. I hope that was okay. It was a time management based decision. But I would be interested to talk more about this if that's something that you'd like. This is a rather deep well for Parley, potentially. I also made a lot of claims in this Parley about approaches to poetry or ways of understanding poetry that in no way did I fully explain any of those things. So, I'm sure you'll let me know. Thank you very much for the Parley. I thought it was fun.